So some of you know that I worked at Starbucks for a while. I love coffee, in case you did not know that. I love coffee. And I was closing one night with my girlfriend, Spring, when we were talking with one of our regulars, two of our regulars, actually. Regulars is someone who comes really consistently. So we saw these two guys like every night. And we were closing one night, and one of the guys looked at Spring and said, you know what, my friend here, he's a great cook. I'm going to have him bring you in some chicken parmesan. He's just a great cook. You got to try his cooking. Now, I knew that my girlfriend Spring was a vegan. She did not eat any meat or any meat byproduct. And so she kindly explained to this gentleman as nicely as she could that she was a vegan and what a vegan was, and then, said, I'm sorry, so I can't eat chicken parmesan. So he stops for a minute and he goes, all right, I got it. We'll bring you in a nice fish dish. So she looks at him, somewhat surprised, and she says to him, I'm sorry, but fish is an animal, and I don't eat any kind of an animal. And he goes, but fish don't breathe air. And I swear to you, now sometimes I exaggerate stories. I am not exaggerating this story at all. The following is completely true. So she looks at him and she goes, well, I'm sorry, I don't eat it. He goes, all right, I got it. We will bring you in a nice shrimp pasta. She goes, a shrimp is an animal. I don't eat any kind of an animal. And he goes, but shrimp don't have faces. And so he stops for a minute and he says to her, all right, how about a pasta in a nice tomato sauce? Now you know where this is going, don't you? If you know a vegan, vegans don't eat any kind of an animal byproduct. So her response was, I'm sorry, I can't if it's made with milk and eggs. And he had just had it by this point. He looks at her and he says, what do you eat? I not only love that story, because I tell you, I was on the floor. I was laughing so hard. But it also was a real challenge for me, because Spring had a thing about the sanctity of life. And she believed that so strongly that she made decisions about how she was going to live that impacted her life pretty dramatically. I mean, if you're a meat eater or not, you kind of have to respect someone who has that kind of dedication to that lifestyle. And so Spring, for me, became one of those people who challenged me to ask the question, do I believe in anything so strongly that I will live my life to that extent? Now, for me, I already gave you an example of a person that, for me, I believe does this. Not perfectly. I'm not going to put you up on a pedestal. I know that you're human, but who does this quite well. And Jesus, in talking with his disciples, looks into the temple and sees an example and a counter example. So it could have been worse. I could have made you the counter example this morning and had you stand up here and say, don't be like Rich. But I'm not going to do that. And so I want to invite you to turn with me to this passage where we find Jesus in the midst of this discussion with his disciples, talking about people who live in exemplary ways. This is Luke 20. We're going to read verses 45 through 47 first. That passage is found on page 856 in your pew Bibles. I would invite you to turn to that passage and just follow along as I read. In the hearing of all the people, he said to the disciples, beware of the scribes, who like to walk around in long robes and love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation. So let's stop there for just a second. if you read scripture for a while, and especially perhaps if you've been going through this series on Luke with me, it's easy for us to kind of begin to get this mentality, and I think it's kind of common for Christians to have this mentality that the scribes and the chief priests and the Sadducees and the Pharisees, they were all bad guys and that they were all doing really bad things. And so the minute we hear any of their names, we immediately have that like boo, hiss kind of attitude. But we have to remember that Jesus is talking to the disciples who were Jewish, who knew that not everybody was bad. Not every person who was a Pharisee or a scribe or a priest was necessarily doing the wrong thing. That actually, for probably a majority of the disciples, when they looked at them, they saw people of faith who they wanted to be like. And so Jesus is continually kind of going back to kind of say, guys, I know that you want to be like these people, but let me show you a little bit more here about what's going on. He's trying to reveal their true character. He's trying to kind of let them in on the truth of these individuals' hearts. And so what do we see in this passage? What is Jesus saying? Well, one of the things he talks about here is that they liked wearing long robes. This was one of those identifiers for a priest and a scribe. It was a robe that they wore which immediately identified them. Today it would be kind of the equivalent to the priest's collar. And so when you see a priest's collar, you immediately go, oh, a clergy person, right? Well, the issue then wasn't the fact that they wore the long robes. The issue was that they liked the attention of getting the long robes. And that's what Jesus is trying to talk about here. It also says that they like the public flattery greetings. Chief priests, scribes, they all had specific greetings that you gave to them in the marketplace. And it wasn't that they didn't, it was cultural. They were supposed to do that, right? Some of us were raised in places where you say sir and ma'am, where you use people's titles, right? Doctor, reverend. You do it out of respect. Well, the issue wasn't that they were being called Reverend, Doctor, Your Honor, whatever it was. The issue was that they liked it. They wanted it in the marketplaces. They wanted to kind of have that little bit of feeling good about themselves that you get when someone flatters you, right? That was the issue. The true issue here with these chief priests and scribes was the fact that they had really begun to use their faith kind of for their own advancement. It was about them. And that's where the issue came in. The issue was they were trying to get stuff for themselves out of it, and they were no longer using their faith to honor the Lord. Now, what's sad about this that we find in verse 47 is the fact that actually not only were they not really necessarily living the lives that they were supposed to, but part of that was they were not paying attention to those that they were supposed to be paying attention to. The widows, the orphans, they weren't being taken care of. And so this then kind of leads us into the next section that we're going to read this morning, the section that I talked about, the widow's offering. He looked up and saw rich people putting their gifts into the treasury. He also saw a poor widow put 2 small copper coins. He said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them, for all of them have contributed out of their abundance. But she, out of her poverty, has put in all she had to live on." This is a pretty common story. I'm sure a lot of us have heard it. And if you've heard it, then you know that actually what she puts in isn't very much money. So there's 2 things that I think really help us understand what's really at play here and that'll help us understand why I said she's an incredible example of faith. And let's start off with this idea of what was the size of her gift. She put in 2 copper coins. 2 copper coins during that day, the copper coin was called a lepta. 1 lepta was 1/128th of a day's wage. So 2 of them was 1/64th, if my math is correct. There are way too many of you who are really good mathematicians, so just go like this and pretend like I'm right this morning, even if I'm not. And it was actually the smallest amount that you were allowed to put into the treasury. By today's standards, it would be right about $1.25. So she has $1.25 in her pocket, and she gives it to the treasury. Now, some scholars look at this and say they connect it with verse 47, where it talks about the fact that the widows' houses are being devoured by the chief priests and the scribes. And that they say that the reason she only has $1.25 in her pocket, the reason she only has these 2 lepta in her pocket, are because the temple taxes have gotten so high and so ridiculous that she can barely afford to live anymore. And so Jesus is pointing her out to say, look at how bad it's gotten. This is all this woman has, and she has to give it to the temple. Sounds really good and really reasonable, but as I began to look through, if you look at where she puts her offering, it begins to change the story a little bit. So where does she put her offering? She puts it into the temple treasury. Now, if you know anything about the temple had all these different courts, and different people were allowed in different places. In the women's court, there were 13 receptacles, interestingly, that apparently look like shofars. And each of them took a different collection for a different purpose. The thing that's interesting about this is that these were not collections that were required by the Jewish faith. These were extras. These were things like to upkeep the golden vessels. These were things like wood for the altar. These were things like incense for the altar. These were simple kind of upkeep things. They were not required at all, and so she puts in her $1.25, her 2 lepta, into this account. Now I want you to think for a moment, and let's put this in the modern day kind of translation. Imagine someone coming in with $1.25 in their pocket. And with that $1.25, they could go down the road to McDonald's and get a McDouble. Might be the only thing they're going to eat all day. And instead, they hand it to one of our property management people and say, would you put this in the property management account? That's about what happened in this story. Now, is it a good offering? Absolutely. But that kind of begins to give you the feel for what this woman is doing. And for me, it begs the question, why? Why, if all you had was $1.25, would you put it into the property management fund? Now, I love you property management guys, but I bet even you would say, please go get a cheeseburger, right? Please go get a cheeseburger. So why would someone give all they had? For me, the answer is that it was where her devotion was. Isn't love one of those things that make you do things that are just make no sense? Isn't devotion one of those things that make you do things that make no sense? Don't you wonder, don't you think perhaps that it was out of love and devotion for the Lord that this woman comes and she gives maybe to the altar? I mean, this is complete speculation, but what if her heart had been, she wanted that money to go toward the incense of a burning sacrifice being lifted up to the Lord because she knew what that meant to her. I love this story. And I love this story because it gives this incredible example and counterexample of 2 lives of faith lived out in very different ways. You have a life of faith on one that is really about earning God's love, earning God's approval. You know, we've been talking a lot through the Old Testament in my Sunday school class, and there's kind of this mentality that goes along with when we hear about all of these laws and these rules and these regulations, and it kind of is this attitude of you have to earn God's love. And the truth is that I can see where that comes from in the Old Testament. So you have these individuals whose life of faith has really become about doing things for their own gain. And doesn't that kind of make sense? if we all kind of have that little piece of us that says, I can't really believe that you love me for who I am, isn't it normal for us to kind of want to earn that, to expect that same thing out of God? Can you imagine living your life like that? And I imagine then that for those chief priests and the scribes, for me, it kind of comes naturally together. They become more like you and like me. Maybe it's just them trying to earn their faith, earn others' love and affection. And then you have this widow. And this widow comes, and out of her love and her devotion for the Lord, she does the complete opposite. Instead of acting and trying to earn God's love and earn others' approval, she comes, and out of her love and devotion, she gives everything that she has. And she knows what she's doing, and she knows what she's giving, and she gives out of that place. I think that is the widow's challenge. The widow's challenge is the question of whether or not we will act our lives out, live out our faith, out of a place of love and devotion, or out of a place that says it's really all about me. I need something out of this. I need to know that I'm loved. I need to know that I'm cared for. And we do, don't we? It's one of those basic human things. We need to know that we are loved and cared for. But the truth is, God says, here's the reality. You already are. You don't have to earn it. You don't have to do anything right. You don't have to check off the right boxes. You don't have to live the perfect life. You are already loved. So just go and live out your life like you're loved. Live out that life of devotion. What would it look like for my faith life to look like that? What would have to change for my faith life to be lived out of a place where I'm not trying to earn God's love, but where I know I'm loved? Sometimes it's going to not make sense, isn't it? Sometimes it's going to mean doing things that don't make sense. But what a blessing to live out of a love instead of fear. That's the God that we have. God is love. And in his abundant love that cannot be contained, it overflows from him and into us. Not till we're filled up, but till we're overflowed. What would it mean for us to live a life like that?